Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today on History Bites, we're going to look at early Islam and the Caliphate. By the end of this History Bite, you will be able to answer the two following questions. How did the rise of Islam reshape the political map of Afro-Eurasia? And how did the politics of the early Caliphate impact later politics in Afro-Eurasia? So, while this is not a theology class, it is important to have a few of the basic teachings of Islam down to understand its later impact. So, in essence, Islam is the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, who was an individual who lived in the province of Mecca in Arabia. And the Prophet Muhammad preached, among many things, that there was one God, and that the followers of his community who were following that one God are called Muslims. Their holy text is referred to as the Quran. And in Islamic tradition, the Quran is given literally from God and the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad. There are also 5 key pillars of Islam that all Muslims must follow, but for the sake of this history class, the only one that we really need to understand is the Hajj, which is the mandatory pilgrimage to Mecca for all Muslims, which helps build a common experience and build an Islamic community based on the experience of this pilgrimage. There's also the concept of jihad, which refers to both a personal but also an external struggle to be true to the Prophet's teachings. And throughout history, you see it demonstrated both personally and externally. This is where we get this term jihad from. Now, one of the other key teachings of the Prophet was that this Islamic community, under the word of God, was supposed to supersede other divisions and obligations. Right? Now, Arabia at the time of the Prophet was divided along clan lines, that is, extended family members. The Prophet himself was subject to discrimination, being from one particular family, and was struggled with other families. But part of the teachings of Islam was that all these divisions would not matter because everybody was one under God. And so the Prophet sought to unite these communities together and overcome these divisions. One community under one God. It's also worth noting that Islam claims itself as an Abrahamic religion, which sees Abraham, the Prophet Abraham, who lived maybe 4,000 years ago, as one of its founding fathers of its religion. This person, Abraham, is also considered a founding father of Judaism and Christianity as religions. On that note, Abraham, Moses, Jesus of Nazareth, all figures important in Judaism and Christianity, are in the Quran as well. And when the Prophet preached his message, he claimed that he was following in the footsteps of these figures. And this similarity would later draw many Christians and Jews to Islam easier than if it hadn't had these figures, recognizable figures, already existing in its religion. Let's talk about the Caliphate. Now, the Caliphate, who is run by a person called the Caliph, is a political and religious leader in the Islamic community. Now, the Caliph is not a holy person. We talk about the Caliph being the successor to the Prophet, but nobody can succeed a Prophet. And so the Caliph is merely supposed to be the leader of the community after the death of the Prophet. Now, in the original tradition, that is immediately after the death of the Prophet, the Caliph was elected by the members of the Islamic community. Everyone got together, they voted, and they said, we're going to have this guy be our Caliph, our leader. But over time, the title of Caliph was sort of usurped by a very wealthy family called the Umayyads, and then they were later usurped by another group called the Abbasids. And so those are the two early caliphates. We are named after the people that ran them and took power. These caliphates would later expand the territory and the influence of the religion of Islam outside of its homeland in Arabia, and that will be addressed in a later history bite. Now, while the Caliphate was supposed to be a special religious community, and the title of Caliph was supposed to be a special religious leader title, by the time of the Abbasid Caliphate, it was effectively an empire with Islam as its central religion. It had all the trappings of an empire. It had currency, administrators, a standing army, and a capital city. It also practiced some tolerance that we see in large empires, such as tolerating Christians and Jews because they were considered similar and close to Muslims. It also imposed taxes like any empire does, and in particular, it had a special tax called the jizya, which is a tax on non-Muslims that convinced many of them to convert. But It's interesting that initially the Caliphate didn't want Muslims to convert because it wanted to continue to rake in this jizya tax. Initially, the Caliphate was also Arab-dominated institution. Arabs held all the high positions. The Caliph was an Arab. But over time, as Islam spreads out and as more people begin to convert, the Caliphate becomes a much more multicultural place with Persians and North Africans and Egyptians and Arabs and all sorts of people, right? And it's worth noting that over time, as the Caliphate expanded, it became more difficult for one man to rule such a large dominion. And gradually the caliphs lost power, and by 1200 CE, they were basically figureheads. And although strong men in little individual parts of the empire might take little bits of territory and forge their own kingdoms or sultanates or emirates, they did tend to acknowledge the caliphs. They said, yes, I'm the leader of this territory, but I acknowledge the caliph in Baghdad as the head of the community. So, last thing to address is something called the Sunni-Shia Split, which comes up later in this course. The Sunni-Shia Split actually has its roots immediately after the death of the Prophet, and it resulted in the question of who should succeed him. Now, the group that believed the Prophet should have been elected was a group referred to as Sunnis, which comes from the word sunnah. However, there was a small but vocal following who believed that a member of the Prophet's family would have been a more appropriate person to lead the community because the Prophet had this special connection via the fact that they had simply received God's revelation. And so a number of people followed the Prophet's son-in-law Ali, and these people eventually became known as the Shia, or partisans of Ali. Now, initially, it wasn't that big of a split, and Ali himself was able to become caliph. He was the fourth caliph. However, about 50 years after the death of the Prophet, the Umayyad Caliphate killed a descendant of Ali at a place called Karbala. And this sort of sealed the effective split, whereby Shia would always identify themselves with Ali's family and the Prophet's family, and Sunnis would identify themselves with the traditions and the elected caliphate. Now, today, about 80% of Muslims would identify as Sunni, and about 15% would identify as Shia. And historically, the caliphs were almost always Sunni. And as a result, the Shia considered themselves sort of the underdogs of history, fighting against corrupt powers they saw as illegitimate and needed to be opposed. And while the split has not always been violent, and Sunni and Shia Muslims live side by side in many places in the world today, it has sometimes been used by political leaders to promote conflict in the name of gaining power, or the differences between the two groups has been used as a way to try to promote legitimacy within a single country. And we'll see this later on in the course. So, thank you for enjoying this history bite with me today. You should be able to answer those two questions from the first slides, and I will see you next time.